The Big Sleep wasn't just Howard Hawks' most celebrated film noir. It was a production so chaotic, so compromised by addiction, studio panic, and censorship, and so fundamentally rewritten after the fact that the film most audiences have seen for 80 years is not the film Hawks originally made. So, let's take a look behind the scenes of the movie with 13 things you didn't know about The Big Sleep, including the Nobel Prize-winning novelist who wrote his portion of the screenplay from a different state entirely, the furious internal memo that forced a complete reshoot almost a year after filming ended, and the murder that not even Raymond Chandler himself could explain, because he had no idea who had committed it either. Now, the screenplay for The Big Sleep was assembled through a process so fragmented and improvised that calling it a collaboration overstates the coordination involved. Howard Hawks needed writers who could translate Raymond Chandler's labyrinthine 1939 novel to the screen quickly, and he hired 3 of them simultaneously, assigning sections of the book rather than building a unified script. Leigh Brackett was the first brought aboard, and her hiring carried its own backstory. Hawks had read her 1944 crime novel No Good from a Corpse and immediately asked his assistant to find the writer. When a woman walked in, Hawks, who had assumed from the prose that he was dealing with a man, reportedly said she wrote like a man, which he meant as a compliment, and which Brackett accepted with the dry professionalism that would characterize her entire Hollywood career. She would go on to collaborate with Hawks on Rio Bravo, El Dorado, and Rio Lobo, and decades later she would write the first draft of The Empire Strikes Back. In 1944, she was simply the writer Hawks trusted to keep pace with Faulkner. William Faulkner was the second name attached, and his presence on the project was, on paper, one of the more extraordinary literary events in Hollywood history. Faulkner was already one of the most celebrated novelists in American literature, The Sound and the Fury and Absalom. Absalom had established him as a figure of genuine literary magnitude. He would win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949. He was also, in 1944, essentially broke, supporting an extended family on income his fiction alone could not generate, and working for Hawks was reliable employment even if it required producing pages at industrial speed in an environment he openly despised. His solution to the challenge of co-writing with Brackett was characteristically eccentric. He walked into the shared office on the first day, divided the chapters of Chandler's novel between them, and retreated to his own room. Brackett later recalled that this was the entirety of their collaboration. She barely saw him again. Then Faulkner asked Hawks if he could work from home. Hawks agreed. Faulkner went home, not to his hotel room in Los Angeles, but to his actual home in Oxford, Mississippi, and mailed his pages in. Jules Furthman handled the rewrites during production, and Hawks himself rewrote continuously on set. The result was a script that no one fully owned, and that no one, as events would prove, fully understood. But the real problem wasn't the fragmented writing process. It was the plot itself, specifically the question of who killed the Sternwood family chauffeur, Owen Taylor, a death that functions as one of the film's central narrative threads, and that is never coherently resolved. Midway through filming, Bogart walked up to Hawks on set and asked directly who had killed Owen Taylor. Hawks didn't know. He found Brackett. She didn't know. They sent a cable to Chandler, who by this point was the obvious authority. It was his novel, his character, his mystery. Chandler's reply, relayed through correspondence he later shared, was unambiguous. He didn't know either. In a letter to a friend written years afterward, Chandler confirmed the exchange and admitted that the chauffeur's death had been left deliberately or inadvertently unresolved in the source material, and that he had no answer to offer the production. The murder that drives a significant portion of The Big Sleep's narrative has no solution. It never did. Chandler had constructed a story with a loose thread he either didn't notice or didn't care about, and by the time anyone thought to pull it, it was already woven into a finished film. Hawks later claimed, with the relaxed confidence of a man who had long since stopped worrying about it, that he had come to believe audiences didn't care if a plot made sense as long as they were enjoying themselves. The Big Sleep's enduring popularity across 8 decades suggests he was not wrong. So, principal photography on The Big Sleep was scheduled to run through late November 1944. It ran through January 12, 1945, nearly 2 months beyond the planned completion date, largely because of Humphrey Bogart. Bogart was in the middle of one of the most turbulent periods of his personal life. He was ending his marriage to his third wife, Mayo Methode, a relationship that had been volatile, mutually destructive, and sustained past any rational endpoint, while simultaneously conducting an affair with Lorne Bacall that was entirely open to everyone on set and that was creating its own complications. He was drinking heavily, not occasionally, not recreationally, but with the dedicated consistency of a man using alcohol to manage a domestic situation he had no other tools for. Hawks and the production were forced to shoot around him on days when he was incapable of working, restructuring the shooting schedule repeatedly to accommodate his availability. Jack Warner sent a memo to the set at one point informing the production that word had reached him they were having fun and that this must stop. The fun, such as it was, did not stop. But neither did the delays. Bogart and Bacall married in May 1945, 3 months after filming finally concluded. However, the production's most consequential crisis did not occur during filming. It occurred afterward, and it nearly derailed the entire project before a single civilian audience had seen it. Warner Brothers, anticipating the end of World War II, made the decision to delay The Big Sleep's release in favor of clearing a backlog of war-themed films they feared would lose their commercial relevance once the armistice arrived. The film sat in a vault while Warner's released its war productions. During this delay, Lauren Bacall was cast in Confidential Agent opposite Charles Boyer, a film that was released in November 1945 and that was by almost every critical measure a disaster. The reviews of Bacall's performance were withering. The New York Times noted she still hadn't learned to act. Her agent, Charles K. Feldman, watched the notices come in and understood that a second consecutive critical failure would effectively end a career that had barely begun. He wrote Jack Warner a letter that was as close to a financial threat as the language of Hollywood correspondence permitted, arguing that if The Big Sleep was released in its current form, Bacall would receive the same reviews and Warner would lose one of his most valuable assets. He asked for the film to be pulled back, reshot, and restructured. He suggested the cost would run somewhere between $25,000 and $50,000 and stated that he would consider it worth $250,000 if necessary. This is exactly why Hawks was brought back to a production he had considered finished to shoot new scenes for actors who had moved on to other projects, with a script that Julius Epstein rewrote for the reshoot without receiving a credit for doing so. Now, the most celebrated product of that reshoot is a scene that did not exist in the original 1945 cut, and that has become, in the decades since, one of the most quoted exchanges in American cinema. The horse racing conversation between Bogart and Bacall, set in a nightclub, in which the two characters discuss horses in language so saturated with sexual double entendre that it is difficult to understand how it passed the censors at all. Hawks later claimed he had written the scene partly because the reshoot schedule was forcing him to miss the races at Santa Anita. Whether or not that is true, the scene is a masterpiece of coded language. The dialogue was constructed so that every line about horses, frontrunners, coming from behind, working out, being in the saddle, functioned simultaneously as a discussion of horsemanship and an explicit negotiation of sexual availability and preference. The Hays Office censors, whose mandate was to prevent exactly this kind of content from reaching audiences, apparently read the scene as genuinely being about horse racing. They approved it without objection. Audiences understood it immediately and completely. The scene remains one of the more elegant examples in Hollywood history of a creative team outsmarting its own censorship apparatus by the simple expedient of taking the censors at their word. But what the cameras didn't show was the full extent of what the Hays Office had already removed from Chandler's source material before the first page of screenplay was written, and how completely the censorship apparatus had altered the film's moral architecture. In Chandler's novel, the character of Arthur Geiger, the rare bookshop owner who is one of the story's first murder victims, is explicitly a gay man involved in a relationship with another man, Carol Lundgren, and is operating a blackmail operation built around pornographic photographs. Carmen Sternwood is described in the novel as nude in Geiger's house during the blackmail session that opens the plot, and later appears nude in Marlowe's bed. None of this survived the transition to screen. Geiger's homosexuality goes entirely unmentioned. Lundgren's relationship with him is scrubbed. The pornography becomes vague references to Carmen in a Chinese dress sitting in a Chinese chair. Carmen appears in Marlowe's apartment fully clothed, and he kicks her out with minimal fuss. The sexual corruption at the novel's core, the specific, layered exploitation of class, sexuality, and photography that gives Chandler's story its particular atmosphere, was replaced with a film that gestures toward transgression without ever naming it. Hawks and his writers were left constructing a mystery whose central crime they were prohibited from describing in plain language. So, the story of how Leigh Brackett came to co-write The Big Sleep is one of Hollywood's more quietly significant anecdotes about gender, assumption, and the way creative work gets attributed. Brackett was, in 1944, primarily known as a science fiction writer, a genre in which she had established herself as one of the more distinctive voices working in the pulp tradition, producing work of sufficient quality and confidence that the predominantly male readership of those magazines either didn't know or didn't care that she was a woman. When Hawks read No Good from a Corpse, and told his assistant to get this writer on the phone, he was operating on the assumption he had drawn from the prose, that he was dealing with a man. Brackett walked in, and Hawks revised his assumption without revising his offer. He later described her as writing like a man, by which he apparently meant writing with authority, economy, and a command of genre conventions that he associated, reflexively, with male writers. Brackett accepted the work, completed her sections of the screenplay at the same pace as Faulkner, and built from that single credit a Hollywood career that would span 3 decades and include some of the most significant screenwriting work of the era. That she spent those decades being described primarily in terms of how she compared to her male peers rather than on her own terms is one of the film industry's more predictable failures of recognition. However, what the cameras showed that audiences were largely prevented from seeing was the performance that Chandler himself identified as the most electrifying in the film, and its systematic removal at the instruction of the studio. Martha Vickers was cast as Carmen Sternwood, the younger, wilder, more overtly damaged of the 2 Sternwood daughters, a role that in Chandler's novel is among the more psychologically complex female characters in the hard-boiled canon. Vickers, who was 22 years old at the time of filming, delivered a performance that Chandler described in a letter with unambiguous admiration. She had, in his assessment, so completely shattered Lauren Bacall on screen that she was making the film's star look inadequate by comparison. This was not a problem for the film artistically. It was a catastrophic problem for the film commercially. Warner Brothers had a significant financial and reputational investment in Lauren Bacall. A supporting actress making the lead look flat was not a situation the studio was prepared to allow to stand. In recutting the film, both between the 1945 and 1946 versions, Hawks removed the majority of Vickers' strongest scenes, reducing Carmen's screen presence substantially and rebalancing the film's emotional center toward Bacall. Chandler noted the result made nonsense of the plot in the sections that relied on Carmen's psychology. He was correct. But the studio's calculation was not about plot coherence. It was about protecting its star. Now, the existence of 2 substantially different versions of The Big Sleep, separated by nearly a year and altered in ways that go considerably beyond the addition of the horse racing scene, is the film's most consequential and least discussed production fact. The 1945 cut, which was completed in March of that year, was never shown to a civilian American audience. It was distributed to American servicemen overseas, screened for troops in the Philippines in August 1945, which is the only reason a print of it survived at all, and then effectively buried when the reshoot version replaced it. The 1945 cut includes the scene in the district attorney's office where the facts of the case are laid out with more clarity than anything in the 1946 version. It includes more of Vickers' Carmen. It does not include the horse racing scene, the nightclub sequence, or the more explicit romantic commitment between Marlowe and Vivian that the 1946 reshoots installed. It is, by most accounts, a slightly more coherent film and a considerably less electric one. In the mid-1990s, the original cut was found in the University of California, Los Angeles Film and Television Archive, restored through funding that included contributions from Hugh Hefner and Turner Classic Movies, and released theatrically for a limited run in 1997. Most critics who have seen both versions agree that the 1946 release is the better film, not because the studio's interference improved the story, but because the added scenes between Bogart and Bacall generate a charge that transforms what would otherwise be a well-crafted thriller into something approaching a cultural event. But what the cameras didn't show was the considerable effort that went into concealing a physical reality about Humphrey Bogart that the conventions of Hollywood stardom in the 1940s required to be invisible. Bogart was, by most accounts, approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall. Not a short man by any objective standard, but shorter than Lauren Bacall, shorter than Martha Vickers, and operating in a film industry that treated the male lead's physical superiority over his female co-stars as a narrative given. Hawks in the production addressed this through a combination of platform shoes for Bogart and deliberate camera positioning that minimized the height differential. Bacall later described being instructed to slump in car seats when seated next to Bogart to ensure that her head did not visibly clear his. The physical architecture of masculinity that the film presents, Bogart's Marlowe as a figure of compact, self-contained authority, was, in significant part, a construction of costume, camera angle, and the willing cooperation of his taller co-stars. This was not unusual for Hollywood of the era. It was simply rarely acknowledged with the specificity that the production records of The Big Sleep make available. So, when The Big Sleep was finally released to American audiences in August 1946, the critical response was warm but not uniformly adulatory. The New York Times offered qualified praise while noting that Bacall still hadn't learned to act, a line that reads, "In retrospect, as one of the more comprehensively wrong critical assessments of the decade. Variety was more generous, recognizing the film's tonal consistency and the specific chemistry between its leads as something that exceeded what either performer might have generated with a different partner. The film's plot was universally acknowledged as impenetrable, and most critics in 1946 treated this as a deficiency rather than a design principle. But the algorithm of history has vindicated The Big Sleep completely, and nowadays it is viewed as not merely the finest film of Howard Hawks' career, but one of the defining works of American cinema in any genre or decade. Roger Ebert included it in his Great Movies list, describing the screenplay as one of the most quotable in film history and the film itself as a black and white symphony. The Library of Congress added it to the National Film Registry in 1997, the same year the restored 1945 cut received its first public screening. Philip Marlowe was ranked the 32nd greatest hero in film history by the American Film Institute in 2003. The horse racing scene is taught in film schools as a case study in how to communicate subversive content within the constraints of a censorship framework. The plot that no one, not Hawks, not Brackett, not Faulkner, not Chandler himself, could fully explain has turned out to be, as Hawks always suspected, entirely beside the point. However, one of the most underexamined dimensions of The Big Sleep is the degree to which the film that most audiences understand as a timeless noir classic is also, in plain sight, a document of wartime America that the studio's release delay accidentally preserved. The bulk of the film was shot between October 1944 and January 1945, during the final year of World War II, and the wartime context is embedded in the film's fabric in ways that a 1946 or subsequent audience would easily miss. The taxi driver who picks Marlowe up is a woman, a detail that in 1944 reflected the wartime reality of women entering traditionally male occupations as men were drafted, and that by 1946 was already becoming an artifact. A gasoline rationing sticker is visible on Marlowe's car window, a B sticker, indicating that the vehicle's driver was deemed essential to the war effort and therefore entitled to 8 gallons of petrol per week. Dead bodies are referred to in the dialogue as red points, a reference to the wartime meat rationing system in which red points were the currency used to purchase controlled food items. These details were not inserted as period texture. They were inserted because they were the current reality of the moment in which the film was made. The year that elapsed between production and release transformed them from contemporary observations into accidental history, a documentary record of daily wartime American life embedded in a murder mystery that had nothing to do with the war and never once mentioned it. But let me know below, is The Big Sleep ultimately a better film because of the studio interference that forced the reshoot? Or does the loss of Martha Vickers' performance and the original cut's narrative clarity represent a sacrifice the film never fully recovered from? And does it matter that the plot is unsolvable? Or is Hawks right that a film this alive from scene to scene earns the right to its own incoherence? Take a side in the comments. If this deep dive changed how you see The Big Sleep, it would massively help me out if you could leave it a like. And you might also want to check out this investigation right here.